The content in this podcast may be difficult and/or triggering. If you or someone you know needs emotional assistance related to this topic or the information in this podcast, confidential help is available here in Canada 24/7 through the National Domestic Violence Hotline by calling 1-800-799-SAFE. That is 1-800-799-7233. This podcast was recorded across the lands, waters, and borders of so-called Canada. We acknowledge that the lands that we work and live on are the ancestral lands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This includes the lands that are unceded, as well as lands that are governed by the promises, much of them unfulfilled, of the numbered treaties. We recognize that settlers have benefited from and continue to benefit from settler colonialism, which depends on borders that have been drawn across Indigenous territories and between the people that live within them. We also acknowledge the manifold ways that settler colonialism has displaced and harmed Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender-diverse people who disproportionately experience gender-based violence in Canada. Across the globe, migrant and refugee women have crossed borders alongside their families in search of safety and dignity. Many of these women have journeyed to countries such as Canada, where in 2011, 21% of the female population were immigrant women and girls. However, these journeys are often dangerous and involve many risks for migrant women and girls, who are more likely to face sexual and gender-based violence due to their intersecting identities. My name is Pauline Tennent. I am a settler, an immigrant, and a mum, and all of this impacts the work I do as a researcher and manager at the Centre for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. In this episode, we talked with Dr. Evie Tastsoglou from St. Mary's University and Dr. Cathy Holtmann from the University of New Brunswick about the systemic factors that shape how migrant and refugee women experience gender-based violence. It's a great pleasure to be sitting here with both of you today. I'm coming to you from Treaty 1 territory in the homeland of the Red River Métis. Winter has finally begun here, and so I hope you are all doing well. We're really thrilled to learn about this project and to share it with our audiences. And so I wanted to start just if you could both introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about who you are and how you came to this project. And maybe we'll start it off with you, Evie.
Hello, everyone. I think I introduced myself last time, so I'll try to be very brief today. I am a professor of sociology and I'm cross-appointed in political science and global development studies at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I have been teaching here at St. Mary's since 1993. I was born in Greece, educated in law and sociology in Greece, the US, and Canada. I have lived in Canada for most of my adult life, and my area of research has been migration, immigration, and gender with various subfields over time. And for the last many years, I've been focusing more specifically on violence in a migration and refugee context, internationally and in Canada. How I came to work on this project, I was invited to put together a Canadian research team to participate in an international project on violence against women, migrants, and refugees, analyzing causes and effective policy response. So I was the PI of a Canadian team that was funded by CIHR, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And we have Dr. Cathy Holtmann joining us today as well. And so maybe if you could just share a little bit about yourself too, Cathy, and how you came to this project.
Thanks, Pauline. I am a professor of sociology at the University of New Brunswick, and my areas of expertise are religion and gender and family violence. And most of my research has involved immigrant and refugee women in Atlantic Canada. I work at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, which is on the unceded and unsurrendered traditional territory of the Wolastoqey people. I came to this project through an invitation from Evie. Evie and I, because we share interest in the lives of immigrant women, we've met each other through academic conferences. And so when she was putting together the Canadian team, I was delighted that she invited me to be part of this important project.
The joys of academic conferences and the people you get to meet. So it's just wonderful to have you both here today. And today's episode, we will be focusing on the concept of the social determinants of health. And Evie, maybe if you could briefly explain, what is that concept? What does that mean?
Beyond traditional biomedical perspectives, we conceptualize health as a social condition shaped by multiple structural determinants, such as legal migration status, financial security, insecurity, language barriers, inadequate cultural and social knowledge, and healthcare accessibility. The latter is largely recognized in the literature as one of the social determinants of health, and these social determinants of health are mediated by gender, intersecting with women's diverse social positions and identities. We zero on help seeking and healthcare access, where migrant and refugee women's intersectional positions shape not only their vulnerability to and experience of violence, but also their ability to access, navigate, and benefit from healthcare and support systems. Migrant and refugee women's limited healthcare accessibility impacts in turn on their health status and ultimately on their settlement and integration journeys. While gender-based violence unambiguously impacts on the health and well-being of survivors, the migration context itself entails unique barriers to migrant and refugee women help seeking and healthcare access, while aggravating any gender-based violence impacts. Legal migration status, economic insecurity, inadequate familiarity with legal systems and social services, cultural and linguistic challenges, as well as systemic limitations affecting even Canadian-born survivors. All of those things interact to shape migrant and refugee women's healthcare access experiences. Regarding health consequences, the participants in this study faced diverse health impacts as Canadian women survivors of GBV, but also health impacts uniquely related to their specific legal migration status as migrant and refugee women. Such impacts consisted of more extensive limitations in accessing healthcare, greater susceptibility to threats by abusive partners, and of non-receiving timely care, especially for post-traumatic stress disorder. The health consequences were diverse, significant, and often long-lasting. The specific impacts extended beyond immediate physical harm, affecting reproductive, psychological, and economic well-being in complex ways. So, in sum, gender-based violence and healthcare inaccessibility affect the health and well-being of migrant and refugee women in Canada. Healthcare inaccessibility aggravates the health impacts of gender-based violence that are also and additionally mediated by migrant and refugee women's intersectional identities. The specific barriers to healthcare access are not just personal challenges, but structural impediments that are tied to policy gaps and institutional practices. Therefore, there is a great need to develop policies that respond to these structural barriers by improving legal protections, adapting services to the needs of migrant and refugee women, and integrating an intersectional approach into policy design and implementation.
I think one of the things that's become really apparent to us through this project, but for many of us who work on the problem of gender-based violence in general, is that these public services such as healthcare or immigrant settlement services, even our criminal justice services, in all of those sectors, they were designed without survivors of gender-based violence in mind. And so many professionals who train for those sectors go into the field unprepared to deal with the health and the immigration and the legal impacts of gender-based violence. And so what we've seen is that those kinds of services or that kind of training is kind of tacked on after the fact so that they can respond more appropriately. But on a structural level, the problem of gender-based violence among migrant women and among survivors generally in Canada is not seen as a structural problem. It's seen as this sort of marginal problem within these larger public services. And because migrant women are marginalized both in terms of their experience of gender-based violence, their experiences as immigrants, and their experiences as women, the service provision for them is also marginalized. And so I think that's an important learning for us, is that our understanding has shown that our policy and legislation has not followed. It still treats gender-based violence as sort of something that happens to happen to some people some of the time. And it's not considering it as a social problem that needs fundamental changes to our social structure.
Absolutely. And I think that really leads to this next question. And it's a word that's come up as we've been chatting quite a bit, and that's intersectionality. And I wonder if you could share with us, what is that concept for you? Why was it used as the foundation for this work?
Intersectionality in this project is used as a critical lens for understanding the differential vulnerabilities. It signals cross-sections of power hierarchies and respective positions of individuals and groups. Intersectionality can only be understood in a contextual or situated manner, as it means specific constellations of power and disadvantage in particular contexts. Ultimately, intersectionality offers a blueprint for social change. So intersectionality in our project operates on multiple levels, from the macro to the meso and the micro. First, migrant women's experiences of gender-based violence are very much shaped by their identities on the basis of gender, race, class, nationality, age, sexual orientation, and all the other forms of social divisions we know. These intersections shape both the forms of violence that they endure and their ability to access help. Secondly, at the meso level, these identities and their intersections are formed and molded by ethnic communities, by networks, by community institutions, practices, and policies, which either directly disadvantage or leave gaps in protection. Lastly, at the macro, which is the institutional level, legal frameworks, policies, and practices also leave gaps in protection or collude to exacerbate vulnerabilities as they intersect. These macro-level institutions reflect in turn intersecting structural global inequalities of capitalism, patriarchy, racism, ageism, or inequalities of the global state system.
I think another aspect of intersectional approach is that different social structures also provide advantages as well as vulnerability, or what we might call strengths. And so we've also looked at the social ecology of resilience as another sort of framework of dealing with these intersectional identities, and how immigrant and refugee women harness the available resources at the different levels of this social ecology, which Evie explained at the micro level, at the meso level, and at the macro level. And so we refer to this as kind of complex inequality, because some aspects of identity may provide resilience and strength, while other aspects of identity are sources of inequality. And so I think the social ecological model that we've used in our analysis sort of takes into account the different intersecting identities and how they cause both vulnerabilities, but how women use the resources available to them, and particularly at the relational and the community level for migrant and immigrant women, because their social support networks are so severely reduced, right? Like upon migration to Canada, they lose their extended networks. They stay often in touch with extended family transnationally, but their local communities, whether that be, faith-based communities, cultural communities, or just, groups of immigrant women who get to know each other through immigration and settlement services, they really become a support network that migrant women who experience gender-based violence reach out to. And And we've found that, yes, context really matters. And so that if immigrant women or refugee women survivors are in an urban context where there's been a long history of migration, there is a more well-developed network. There may even be services offered by immigrant women to immigrant women survivors that, help them to overcome barriers of language or barriers of understanding, specifically how immigration and the immigration processes cause vulnerability. So, yeah, we see a lot of variety across the country, but also a lot of potential for those areas where those resources are not yet fully developed.
Thank you for that. It sounds, like these complex inequalities in strengths and resilience, but in a lot of ways, resistance too, coming out just in what you shared. And I love that the blueprint for social change, because it just takes that intersectionality as a concept and makes it very real. So if you could imagine if those systems that you mentioned that don't have those ideas in mind at the beginning and are just sort of adding them in and stirring after the fact, like how different it could be if that was built into it and this blueprint for change. How did intersectionality as a concept influence the approach that you took in terms of research methods, the data analysis, and maybe just remind for folks who haven't listened to the first podcast, who were your participants in this project?
Intersectional approach was chosen with the recognition that there was something distinct and specific about gender-based violence in migration and refugee contexts, and that the legal immigration status or citizenship status, if you like, is a very important hierarchy of power, an axis of power that in its intersection with gender, race, class, and other such hierarchies should be taken into account in understanding the particular gender-based violence experiences of migrant and refugee women. Beyond the legal immigration status, the social identity of being an immigrant, a foreign-born, an outsider, should also be taken into account in understanding vulnerabilities of immigrant and refugee women. Not knowing where to seek help, for example, whether to trust the police or the medical system, needing to use an interpreter who may have their own biases, not knowing how to navigate housing, healthcare access, family support, or education, not having social support systems. These are distinct vulnerabilities of immigration as a social category. It was what we felt was of paramount significance, the dimension of a legal immigration status that had to be taken into account, and then the dimension of migrant and refugee women as a social category. Of course, beyond that, there were all the other intersectionalities that I mentioned, but we felt that those in particular had to be taken, were paramount, were primary in understanding the experiences of migrant and refugee women. There was also an understanding that the terms migrant and refugee denote a range of legal statuses, each with its own distinct rights and responsibilities in the context of particular societies, and that we had to understand the specific positionalities in terms of such sets of rights and responsibilities, as well as the intersection of them with other important social dimensions of power in the specific context. So our intersectionality has been not generic intersectionality, but a contextual or situated one in that sense. The second part of the question had to do with how this approach influenced us in terms of methodologies and analysis. We embarked early on in trying to understand the Canadian and other national legal and gender-based violence protection contexts. Okay, there were 7 countries involved. And secondly, the gender-based violence experiences of various categories of migrants and refugees in such a context. We strove to understand the gender-based violence experiences in a dual way, through key informant interviews and through gender-based violence survivors' own voices. And we did, I think, 43 key informant interviews and 48 survivors. At the same time, we took into account the particular gender, sexual, class in terms of education and employment, race, and other identities of our women participants. So our analysis was contextual, but it was also intersectional. Similar types of analysis took place in the other countries' research teams, so that in the end we could, but only contextually, compare findings across societies.
Yeah, I just have a little bit to add in terms of our data collection. We took a regional approach to data collection because Evie and I are both in the Atlantic region, but Myrna is in central Canada and Lori is in Western Canada. So we divided the country up. Canada, all the other 6 countries could fit in Canada plus more. So we're enormous geographically, but I think it was also important for us to get provincial diversity because our immigration is shared between the federal and the provincial governments. And same healthcare dollars go and gender-based violence dollars get divided regionally and provincially, and every province has different approaches to using that funding. So it was important for us to have participants from all of those regions. And I think also a key component to data collection was when we began, we wanted to interview key informants from, government policy, immigration, settlement services, and gender-based violence services. But we also recruited survivors, so refugee and immigrant women survivors from organizations that worked with them because of the level of vulnerability that these women experience, both as survivors of gender-based violence, but perhaps as people whose immigration status is precarious. We didn't want to put those women at any further fear or vulnerability because it's extremely difficult for someone to talk about these kinds of experiences. And so we originally recruited survivors from organizations that could support them.
Thank you for that. And also just the sheer number of interviews that were done with so much data I can imagine that came from that. I wonder, Evie, if I can put the question to you, within this project, violence is often framed as systemic or structural. What do you mean by that?
Systemic or structural foundations of gender-based violence facilitate the emergence of interpersonal incidents. That is, we make this distinction between violence, gender-based violence happening interpersonally, and then the systemic foundations of it. So gender-based violence in migration contexts exhibits a dual character. It is rooted in global structures of gendered and racialized inequality, but manifests itself in its national setting differently. Structural barriers such as restrictive immigration laws, securitized borders, underfunded support services create conditions of precarity that expose women to violence at every stage, at every step in the process of migration, in the journey of migration. For example, women face heightened risks during the journey itself. Limited legal pathways force many to rely on smugglers or endure informal border crossings, where physical, sexual, and emotional violence by traffickers, border guards, or fellow migrants is commonplace. Upon arrival, ambiguous or dependent legal statuses reinforce women's fear of deportation or family separation, trapping survivors often in abusive relationships. Many national systems exclude then specific categories, undocumented or precariously documented women, from social assistance, from healthcare, from legal aid, from settlement services. Across countries, siloed services that do not communicate, and a lack of trauma-informed multilingual support mean that women frequently find no safe route to report violence. So the gender-based violence project affirms that violence against migrants and refugee women is neither inevitable nor only the result of individual actors. It is deeply embedded in global migration governance, legal regimes, and intersecting systems of inequality. Effective prevention and redress require systemic change, that is, laws that protect rather than punish, inclusive services that empower rather than marginalize, and policies that are co-produced with those most affected. By illuminating both shared structural roots and context-specific diversities, the gender-based violence project offers a roadmap for scholars, practitioners, and policymakers committed to gender justice in migration.
I guess the one thing I would add is what we're seeing in Canada as a response to the systemic or structural nature of the experiences of migrant and refugee women and gender-based violence is we see coming together of the immigrant settlement sector and the anti-gender-based violence sector in recent years. I think the collaboration across sectors, because both sectors sort of know their constituents well. And as I said earlier, immigrant and refugee women kind of straddle those sectors. And so I think the coming together of service providers to develop strategies. And so we now have sort of a national strategy for responding to gender-based violence committed against migrant and refugee women. And then now that strategy's been developed, there's a series of training modules and education modules being developed, again, co-developed by folks in the sector, so that if one is working in the immigrant sector, one would get, more information on how to best respond and work with the complexity of gender-based violence among their clients, and vice versa in the anti-gender-based violence sector. Because even in our data a lot, because they're both really complex structures and systems within these structures, that professionals working in those sectors need more information about what's going on that's outside of their level of expertise. And so I think that this collaboration, this national collaboration that we've seen happen and is underway, I think is really good. And that's from the grassroots, right? Like that came from immigrant settlement service providers and gender-based violence service providers in the absence of a national initiative around that. And I think that holds great promise, because the people who have most invested in the well-being of survivors of gender-based violence are creating those resources and tools so that they can better respond.
Thank you for that. A bit of positive change and seeing it from the ground up there. Our follow-up question to that is just, how does an intersectional approach to the social determinants of health help explain the systemic nature of sexual and gender-based violence for migrant and refugee women? And I know we've touched on that a little bit already, but just if you wanted to follow up there.
The social determinants of health involve structural barriers, such as legal, financial, linguistic, cultural and social knowledge, healthcare access, that are intersecting with gender, class, gender identity, age, race, and other social positionalities and identities relevant in particular societal contexts. These structural barriers can be traced to law and policy frameworks. For example, barriers linked to migrant and refugee women's legal migration status, resulting in services accessible only through payment. Okay. Resettled refugees have immediate access only to the so-called Interim Federal Health Program, IFHP, while refugee claimants have access to the same program for essential care services. Or, for example, linguistic barriers due to a scarcity of interpreters and funding for their services. These structural barriers to accessing healthcare result de facto in the perpetuation of the trauma of sexual and gender-based violence for migrant and refugee women. So it can be said that the systemic nature of sexual and gender-based violence can only be understood if we take into account the particular legal migration status of the survivors in interaction with other forms of social discrimination, that is, through an intersectional approach.
The only thing I would add to that is that we see, we heard from service providers in particular, how the complexity of those structures often get used as a tool for the perpetuation of gender-based violence. So, for example, if a woman is in a relationship and she has a precarious migration status, or maybe not even be aware of what her exact legal status is, or where the process of immigration is, that can be used as a threat to control and to continue to keep them isolated and fearful, rather than reach out for help. And so the system itself then becomes used by perpetrators to continue to isolate and abuse migrant and refugee women. And if they do have the courage and the support to leave a relationship in which this is happening, there are provisions within the immigration and legal aspects of migration, but women need proof, right? Like they need to substantiate what has happened to them so that they can receive a visa or a temporary visa because of compassionate grounds, because they're a survivor of gender-based violence. But obtaining that evidential information, right, about their status and about what's been done to them, that's really difficult because they might not have access. They may have left without even their own documentation. So, it is an enormous challenge to provide services with these kinds of frameworks in place, especially when the framework themselves are being used to perpetrate abuse.
Yeah. Following the intersectional approach, and I think, we've chatted a little bit about these broad patterns, but then also the specifics as well. How does social location or social groupings influence the experiences of sexual and gender-based violence for migrant and refugee women?
Social locations, or more specifically, locationality, that is, the state of having a specific social location in terms of an institutional and social context, greatly affects our life experiences, the way that we know things, but also specific ways of thinking and feeling. Sometimes social scientists use the term of social position or positionality to refer to social and institutional context, which includes social identities that shape our perspectives. That is, the locations or social or positions shape our mental structures, the way that we think. But the way that we are, I guess, socialized to think does not necessarily determine what we actually do. Now, based on the above, I read this question as asking about the institutional and social context of sexual and gender-based violence in Canada in the context of migration and how intersectionalities of various social identities shape the experiences of sexual and gender-based violence. So Canada is home to a large immigrant population, with 23% of the Canadian population born outside of the country, and more than 1/4 of the female population reported as migrants in 2021, with a majority of them coming from particular backgrounds in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Based on an analysis of 2018 national data on domestic and intimate partner violence, about 30% of immigrant women had experienced some form of gender-based violence at the hands of an intimate partner in their lifetime. In particular, vulnerability to gender-based violence is 3 times higher for racialized women as compared to non-racialized and non-Indigenous women. Migrant and refugee women face unique risk factors for domestic and intimate partner violence due to the structural inequalities at the intersection of immigrant identity, status, gender, ethnicity, race, and class. We argue that the same social hierarchies and their interplay are reflected in institutional barriers of legal and policy frameworks, identifiable either as concrete policies creating or increasing, exacerbating the vulnerabilities, or as absent from protection. So Canada has legislation, of course, and policies both addressing gender-based violence and protecting all migrants. I'm going to refer to the strategy each time, Canada's strategy to address and prevent gender-based violence. And I'm going to refer, of course, to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. It is argued in the literature, however, that existing state strategies remain limited in successfully responding to gender-based violence, particularly for women and girls in marginalized communities, and that includes migrants and refugees. This limitation is contributing to the further reproduction of gender-based violence experiences. The limited successful response to gender-based violence by the state is broadly generated by an overdependence on criminal justice frameworks in constantly shaping state responses to violence. It is generated by a lack of intersectional understandings of gender-based violence in legislation and policy documents, a lack of intersectoral collaboration, conceptual gaps in gender-based violence and human rights, policy issues of eligibility and access to protection, as well as, finally, neoliberal tendencies in current migration and service provision policies, which signal significant cuts in services. Federal, provincial legislation and policies in Canada are generally criticized for not efficiently recognizing and addressing the social, economic, and political determinants of gender-based violence and their interlocking relations. This is argued to result in a so-called tunnel vision, whereby the problem of violence is individualized, depoliticized, and or culturalized, that is transformed into a cultural issue. For instance, many migrant women in Canada are shown to experience a downward socioeconomic mobility, that is not being able to practice their profession, remaining unemployed or underemployed for an extended period after resettlement, or experiencing increasing economic dependence on their spouses. While economic vulnerability is a crucial factor that would increase women's susceptibility to gender-based violence and would limit their chances to disclose violence and seek help, such challenges are often overlooked under neoliberal migration policies. Intersecting with the class barriers, other systemic inequalities and discriminations are in place that significantly affect accessibility to support and services in Canada for migrant and refugee women. We have, for example, inadequate language translation or interpretation services, a limited cultural competency in service provision. Depending on legal migration status, there is a lack of or limited eligibility for services, such as healthcare access, income assistance, settlement services. Previous experiences and or fear of discrimination and racism primarily prevent racial and ethnic minority women, migrant women, from accessing services. And finally, one-size-fits-all solutions, primarily based on westernized rescue and prosecute strategies, without considering diversities in women's experiences, perspectives, and needs and wishes, contribute to decreasing migrant and refugee women's likelihood of accessing and benefiting from the available services. Now, most recently, and Cathy mentioned that, there is a national action plan to end gender-based violence that was announced in 2023. The action plan is supported by a significant federal financial investment and bilateral agreements with each province, aiming at addressing challenges specific in each province. And secondly, the action plan is supported by monitoring mechanisms over the short, medium, and long term. Although the action plan has generated a great deal of enthusiasm and commitment, it remains to be seen how effective it will be overall in reducing gender-based violence.
Part of when we talk about cultural sensitivity of service providers, it's understanding that for many survivors of gender-based violence, whether they're immigrant, refugee, or Canadian born, it's an enormous challenge to recognize that what's happening is gender-based violence because of the ways that behaviors and attitudes and language have normalized much of what we would consider violence and abuse. And so if someone is coming from a culture that is unfamiliar to service providers, then that makes it even more difficult, right? Because the cultural norms may prevent women from recognizing and naming it, but there's also norms that say that this is something we should deal with ourselves. This is a private issue, not a public issue. And in Canada, we say it's a public issue, but as Evie said, we address it on an individual level as opposed to a collective level. And if we do address it on a collective level, then those structures of inequality, such as racism and sexism, prevent us from seeing that this is a cross-cultural problem, but we need culturally sensitive people who are open to learning more about the specificities of people's culture in terms of understanding what they're experiencing and then how to best support them in a road to safety.
Thank you for that. As migrants, citizenship status is very impactful in shaping the experiences of migrant and refugee women, and you've both shared that a little bit through this conversation. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit, how does citizenship impact the vulnerability of migrant and refugee women in terms of sexual and gender-based violence?
I would say that it's an enormous factor. And I think it's becoming even more of a factor as our federal government reduces the quotas on immigration, while the provincial governments are still wanting to increase the numbers coming through provincial nominee programs. And then the Canadian public in general has a much more critical and I would say negative opinion of immigrants. Environics has looked at the public opinion on immigrants in Canada, and in the last decade, it has flipped. And so the majority of Canadians used to think that immigrants were good for our country and, improved our quality of life and were needed by the labor market. And now the majority of Canadians feel that there are too many immigrants in our country, that they're putting, enormous strain on our housing. And so we've seen a real shift at that level too. It's government and public have increasingly developed critical and negative attitudes towards immigrants. And so this tightening of immigration policy, while at the same time public opinion and public discourse has been increasingly negative, I think that makes that factor for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. The citizenship journey becomes that much more challenging and impacts them. We spoke with women who chose to speak with us, but we all know as gender-based violence researchers that many people don't come forward. And so my suspicion is that this kind of climate will make it less likely that women will report.
Yeah, you are right, Cathy, and we had quite a bit of difficulty in actually recruiting the women, I might say, as an aside, despite our very rigorous ethics protocol and our great relationships with community organizations, both in the anti-violence and settlement sectors, and having an advisory board consisting of members of those communities and so on. But to the question, I would like to start off by explaining our conceptualization of citizenship, what we mean by citizenship. It's a dynamic interrelationship of economic, social, political, civil, and psychological dimensions. That is, it goes beyond the legal passport holding sense of citizenship. It is a sociological understanding that involves an ongoing interrelationship between those dimensions that I just mentioned, where aspects of citizenship interact with one another. And we also emphasize an understanding of citizenship as a practice that is not a status, but a practice, something that people do. So that's the sociological understanding of citizenship. So when it comes to gender-based violence, we see it as first a result of a breakdown or inadequacy of rights and protections. In the literature, this has been called an incomplete or diminished citizenship. Diminished citizenship facilitates the occurrence of gender-based violence, or it increases the vulnerability of prospective victims. We argue that once gender-based violence takes place, it becomes much harder for the survivors to engage in diverse forms of participation, that is, the practice of citizenship. Intersecting discriminations originating in reduced rights in complete citizenship exacerbate vulnerability to or experience of gender-based violence for migrant and refugee women, thereby reproducing a diminished citizenship for them in terms of social, economic, and political participation and sense of belonging. So there is an interactive kind of dual relationship where one affects the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think just the reminder of things interacting and being interrelated and intersectionality. Our follow-up question is just, how does citizenship interact with gender, with race in the lives of migrant and refugee women?
In our research, we document the ways in which intersecting discriminations leave migrant and refugee women inadequately protected from gender-based violence or the threat of it, which acts as barriers to citizenship. We adopt a situated or contextual intersectionality approach, exploring the outcome of intersections of discrimination at the macro, meso, and micro levels on the gender-based violence experiences of survivors in Canada. The primary intersection is that of gender with legal or citizenship status. However, beyond that, we look at race and other forms of social division. And here I have, if I may, a couple of examples from our interviews with key informants. So one, for example, describes intersectionality as the layers of a woman needing to be identified for her as a service provider to understand the complete picture, connecting gender with class and race in this particular example. So in her words, intersectionality is a big one. There's multiple layers that we have to look at in order for our work to be effective. It's like peeling back, if you want, an onion. Okay, where conjugal violence is one element, but there's many other elements. There's oppression, there's culture, there's values, there's poverty. So I believe that although we've done a lot of work in that area, there's much more to do around the immigrant population and some of their needs. And then LGBTQ plus women and men are both susceptible to gender-based violence. That's another dimension of the LGBTQ dimension with gender and immigration status. The intersection of gender identity, sexual orientation, and violence have resulted in horrifying cases of persecution. Many countries still do not recognize LGBTQ plus individuals, nor the horrific crimes against them. Women have been forced into exceptionally traumatizing situations such as corrective rape in attempts to change their sexual orientation. Many service providers identified the violence facing the LGBTQ community as one of the most pressing. I chose a couple of examples from the macro level and then the micro level. So the macro level, from a key informant interview, they can't go through income assistance. They are not eligible. They can't apply for BC housing. So this is in British Columbia. They can't use medical services. And if in that situation with their sponsorship is either being considered or when they are in limbo, if they actually apply for medical services, that information is passed on to immigration. Yeah, so you have systems here, criminal system and immigration system, and family law system not talking to each other. And this is what I am saying, that you need these things in place for a society to function. So she is talking here about the disjuncture between criminal law, immigration systems, social services, and so on. And the inadequacy, basically, of services and the fear of information being shared with the wrong hands. And so these are real things happening at the macro level, how policies operate and practices at the macro level. From another key informant, I was just kind of brought in like a month later to help her get a permit, and then it was just kind of by happenstance. I said, "So what shelter are you staying at?" And she said, "What's a shelter?" Just to give you here a sense of how people are not on the same page here culturally. At the micro level, when women are with precarious immigration status, that's incredibly risky. This is from a key informant in Nova Scotia. Then they might stay in a situation and sometimes risking their own physical safety for much longer, because sometimes if their partner is the sponsor, they can, threaten to withdraw sponsorship. Now, despite the obstacles that migrant and refugee women face, they can and do work out solutions, and they craft strategies strengthening their resilience to gender-based violence and gradually exercise economic and social agency in their lives. Recognizing the need for a stronger voice, they have created outlets that allow their voices to be heard. These outlets exist in both informal groups where they can share their experiences, but also formal groups and associations that aid future migrant and refugee women. And here a key informant describes this process in the development of a council founded by migrant and refugee women. They identified that as an issue here, and so they got together, formed at first. It was just, an informal group. They came up with a name, but then they applied for a grant and they got government funding, and then they incorporated. And they've been doing a lot of work to educate the community here about gender-based violence and newcomers. So this is a grassroots initiative that started from a few friends getting together and then providing services for others, not just helping themselves. Migrant and refugee women display tremendous acts of strength in their everyday life, from their decision to leave the home country and start a new life in an unfamiliar place, to dealing with abusive situations and reaching out to support services. So here, in the words of another key informant, she's talking about one of her clients. She called me recently to say that she finished her 4th year of university. She went back to school. I'm so proud of her. She was being abused. She went back to school and finished. I think a lot of that was that the woman has a spine of steel, honestly speaking, because, she made it through on her own with a little bit of emotional support from me and a little bit of support from the outreach worker at strategic points when she really needed it. To the rest of the time, it was all her doing. I think we should recognize the tremendous initiative and act of strength in acting out of strength of the woman, the survivor.
Thank you. I mean, it's funny, like when you do qualitative data and just the way the stories sometimes stick with you years after a project is done. How do the broader social determinants of health, and we've talked about access to healthcare in this project, but also housing, employment, how do they impact the experiences of sexual and gender-based violence for migrant and refugee women?
Well, I don't have evidence directly from survivors of gender-based violence, but we did analyze interviews with service providers, and many of them expressed that they encounter ethical dilemmas because they are unable to provide long-term solutions for some of these, or long-term options for migrant and refugee women. And so because, as I explained earlier, we don't have a broad systemic approach to gender-based violence, and that there's inadequate resources from government to the existing supports, that many of the service providers said we can provide short-term crisis housing, and children of these survivors will say to their mothers, before we had a house and we had a whole life, and now we're confined to a room and we don't even have our own home. And so there was some, the service providers were saying that, this puts them in a really hard place because they want to support these women. But after their stay in temporary transitional housing, many of them are forced to go back to their abusive spouses because they can't afford housing on their own. And so the lack of affordable housing for all survivors of gender-based violence. And I think also, as Evie spoke, the devaluing of immigrant women's education and credentials then also results in not getting, the kinds of jobs that are commensurate with their education and work experience. And so then they're in low income jobs, which again prevent them from accessing housing that is safe, and even if there is available affordable housing. And so, those factors tend to exacerbate the existing situation of sexual and gender-based violence for these women.
As Cathy said, we don't have specific, that is, we have not done a systematic analysis of housing and employment and the impact of those social determinants on health, on the experiences of sexual and gender-based violence and recovery from it, I guess, by migrant and refugee women. But we have done quite a bit about access to health care as a social determinant of health. Focusing on migrant and refugee women, social scientists have conceptualized the social determinants of health for migrant and refugee women as operating on a macro level, legal, policy, economic, physical, and social environments. The community level, that comprises institutions, networks, neighborhoods, amenities, and family and individual levels, and that includes education, employment, economic dependency, religion, health behaviors, migration status, and even family status. There is a complex interplay between these levels and the concrete life course of the individual migrant woman. So no matter how you look at it, access to health care is definitely a factor, a social determinant of health impacting the health status of migrant and refugee women. And that's what we have focused on in this project. And I think I reported earlier on our findings, but we haven't done the systematic analysis on housing as a social determinant of health specifically, or on employment as a social determinant for health. And we should keep in mind that health has an impact on integration. So the same factors, healthcare accessibility, housing, and employment, also have an impact on integration.
We would love to hear from you both, given your involvement in this project. What would you want service providers to know about the systemic nature of violence for migrant and refugee women?
I take it that when you ask what we would like service providers, that you mean policymakers as well, not just service providers, but maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, the international collaboration that was fostered by the International Gender-Based Violence Project allowed us as researchers to carry out in-depth research on gender-based violence in the context of migration in our unique national settings, while at the same time anchoring our analysis within the framework of a global understanding of gender-based violence. Our research highlighted the need for a situated or contextual intersectional approach which understands gender-based violence as a global problem rooted in global structures of inequality, but at the same time notes that migrant and refugee women experience gender-based violence differently according to their intersectional positioning across spatial, temporal, and social locations within unique economic, cultural, political, and ideological state settings. So a key finding across all of our country case studies and a global parameter in gender-based violence generally was the predominant role of the state, which is also supported by all kinds of other research. How this role unfolds, however, refers to more context-specific conditions, that is, context-specific institutions and laws. These include laws and policies relating to gender-based violence protection and prevention, but also laws and policies referring to border crossing, asylum and refugee status determination, migrant and refugee settlement, citizenship and integration. In addition, context refers also to the layer of implementation of laws and policies on the ground. So our national case studies pointed to the specific ways in which global gendered and racialized representations of migrants and refugees across states contribute to creating risks of both symbolic and physical violence that is perpetrated by states and individuals against migrant and refugee women. So this is done in a number of ways, through the securitization and militarization of border control, through culturalist discourses which treat gender-based violence in migration as a product of the other and as a product of violent cultures, barbaric cultures, we used to call them in Canada at the previous era, while overlooking at minimizing the violence which migrant and refugee women may face. And finally, through limited conceptions of GBV and human rights in law and policy, absence or inadequacy of law and policy, for example, no explicit definition, exclusion of categories from protection, and so forth, and implementation of policy, which includes inaccessibility of protection, interprovincial and intersectoral gaps in collaboration. So through all of these things, all of these factors are the doings of states, okay? The particular forms differ, but overall we can say that it is states, that is a structural, institutional layer that contributes to creating risks of or results in gender-based violence. As we conclude, the project resulted in a collective volume that appeared in 2022, and we write in it at a time when gender equality and particularly campaigns against gender-based violence benefit from a particularly hopeful political momentum internationally, post-Me Too. It is sobering to examine the ways in which migration policies are crafted and implemented, and the instrumentalization of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers means that this political momentum often fails to reach migrant and refugee women. Basically, if I can use one word, we want to convey the need to understand the structural underpinnings of violence. And we want to do that to both service providers as well as policymakers, and reach as many people as we can. Civil society needs to develop that additional vigilance. It is our ethical responsibility as researchers and as individuals to do so.
Thanks, Evie. I think the enormous weight of those structural systemic problems is borne by service providers. And we heard a lot from service providers about how enormously difficult it is for them to carry out their work. It's a very stressful environment, it's under-resourced, and the demand is always more than they can deal with. And this leads to burnout, it leads to staff turnover. Most of the workers in this area are women themselves. Many of them are migrant women or racialized women. And so this sector is accomplishing a lot, I think, with very limited resources. But the shortcomings are not individualized, right? Like they're not the responsibility of individual organizations and agencies, nor are they simply the lack of training, perhaps, or knowledge of individual workers. This is as Evie aptly described, an enormous structural problem that is getting worse in our countries. And at the ground level, we really heard a lot about how very, very challenging this environment is for workers. And I think in one way to congratulate the workers who put in this kind of dedication into trying to protect and make their lives safer. But at the same time, that I think, as I said earlier, the ray of light is when anti-gender-based violence service providers are working collectively at the provincial level and at the national level. Similarly, as immigrant settlement service providers start to collaborate more with anti-gender-based violence agencies and organizations so that they can offer training, support, education, and then work together on a national strategy, or at least be part of this national strategy on gender-based violence in our country. And I think that's where, for me anyway, I see the hope, because it's also very, very difficult for service providers to put pressure on government because government supplies the funding for their services. And so it'd be wonderful we could all be equally political and not suffer the consequences of putting pressure on our elected officials. But I think as coalitions and as national organizations, they are stronger. And then they can speak with one voice and not get singled out at the provincial level for pushing back on some of these inadequate policies and inadequate levels of funding for their very, very important work.
Through applying intersectional and social ecological approaches, this discussion with Evie and Cathy revealed how systemic the issue of gender-based violence is for migrant and refugee women. We learned how intersecting identities shape both the likelihood of gender-based violence for migrant and refugee women, as well as their networks of resilience within their communities. In spite of the systemic barriers that they face, the migrant and refugee women who participated in this project continue to persevere as survivors of gender-based violence. This podcast would not be possible without the GBV-MIG project, which is funded through the GenderNet Plus joint call on gender and the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. This podcast was produced by CHRR's Knowledge Mobilization Coordinator, Angela Ciceron. We are also indebted to the rest of the GBV-MIG team for their work on this project.